We are back. Senators, Twins, baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The co-hosts of the show are Ronnie Rabinovitz and George Case III. How you doing, Ronnie?
Good. How are you, Ralph?
All right. And George, you have a guest for us. George Case III has a guest for us today, and you guys are going to interview him and have a wonderful show. So take it away, George Case III.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph. It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Sarnoff to our podcast audience. I've known Gary for 5 or 6 years, and he's an author of several books, and the book that in particular with regard to this podcast with Washington Senators called The Wrecking Crew of 33, and I'm going to let Gary get into that, but I just wanted to introduce him, and I'm so happy to have him on the show. And Gary, you might want to advise the listeners of this podcast a little bit about your background and how you got your really interest in Washington baseball.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for having me here this morning, George. I appreciate it. And I'm from Chicago originally, but I like the Senators. I grew up as a Cubs fan, but my secondary team was the Washington Senators, and that was really because of Frank Howard. Frank Howard was an all-star while I was growing up, and I was always intrigued by his size and his ability to hit the ball so far. I mean, every home run you may recall he hit was a moonshot. So that always intrigued me. That made me a Senators fan, and as time went by, I became interested in the history of the Washington Senators, mostly because they seemed like a unique team. They had, as you know, they moved out of Washington after the 1971 season, and because they were mostly had a checkered history, most of their teams weren't very good. However, they did have one era in the 1920s and 1930s where the Senators were among one of the best teams in Major League Baseball. So I was always interested in learning more about them, so I did a lot of reading during my younger days about the Senators, and I was just always very intrigued by their teams and always very intrigued by their miracle story of 1924 when they came out of nowhere to win the only World Series in the history of Washington baseball. And as time went by, I became more interested in the 1933 team and knowing more about that. I was particularly interested in the era of the 1930s, and because the Senators had won a pennant in the 1930s, and in 1933, I just became motivated to learn more about that team, and I was especially attracted to Buddy Meyer. He became my favorite player of yesteryear, and of course, he was the starting second baseman of that team.
You know, I'm glad, Gary, I'm glad you brought up Buddy Meyer because I've always been curious. You and I have had many conversations, but, you know, your interest in the fact that Buddy is your favorite player, and Buddy and Meyer and my dad were not only teammates but good friends. I thought maybe you would talk a little bit about Buddy's career because, you know, he was one of the Washington players that's probably not known to many fans, and yet he was one of the best players in the American League during his era.
He sure was, and many people believe that he belongs in the Hall of Fame. If you take a look at his lifetime stats and you compare him to other second basemen, he certainly does have a case to be in the Hall of Fame. He had quite a career. He started with the Washington Senators as a shortstop. They traded him to the Red Sox because they didn't think he was a good enough defensive shortstop. They thought he was more of a liability in the field. However, they soon regretted that trade, and they brought him back to Washington after spending a season and a half in Boston, and they made him into a second baseman where he really found himself. He became an outstanding defensive second baseman, and, of course, he was always a great hitter, and he won a batting title in 1935, and he was a huge part of the 1933 pennant-winning ball team as well, and he had a lifetime batting average of .303, and he is considered one of the best players in Washington baseball history, rightfully so, too.
Well, I happen to agree with that, Gary, and I'm glad you mentioned that about Buddy because, again, I feel very few people really, you know, when they think about Washington baseball, they think of, you know, the great players, Walter Johnson and Goose Goslin and Sam Rice and Clark Griffith and Joe Cronin and all the players that participated or were in the management position with the Senators, including Clark Griffith. But Buddy Meyer is often overlooked. And I can tell you for a fact, my dad and Buddy Meyer were very close, and my father always thought that Buddy was just such a great player and a tremendous competitor. My dad used to laugh because he'd say, Buddy's like a Jekyll and Jekyll and Hyde, because off the field he's very quiet and unassuming, but on the field he was just very combative, and his competitive nature was just huge. Buddy Meyer always wanted to win, and he was a great player.
Yeah, he was a fierce competitor, and he was wanted. Clark Griffith, who, as you know, owned the Senators for many, many seasons, he was hoping that after Meyer had retired, that Meyer would consider managing the Senators someday, but Meyer wanted to go on to other things, and he went into business, and he became a very successful businessman, made millions of dollars, and did very well for himself. Having that competitive spirit that he had in baseball, he carried that spirit throughout the rest of his life and through his career.
The one thing I think you might want to talk about a little bit, Gary, your book. I've been fascinated by the book. It's called The Wrecking Crew of 33, and you really talk about the Washington Ball Club of that year, and the fact that was the last championship season for a Washington Ball Club ever. And to me, that's something that's also overlooked. We talk about the Cubs and all those years, but from 1924 and 24 when they won the World Series, 25 the American League pennant, and then 33 managed by Joe Cronin, who happened to be Clark Griffith's son-in-law. That was the last American League championship or any championship in the history of Washington, D.C. So why don't you talk a little bit about that team and who was on it and what happened that season, because I think it's really very fascinating.
Okay. I appreciate that very much. Just to let you know, and then I'll let our listeners know, the Senators, they did win the World Series and pennant, of course, in 1924, and the pennant in 1925, and they didn't win another pennant until 1933. However, they were very content. They were contenders year after year. However, they had the unfortunate distinction of running into baseball's two greatest dynasties. They ran into the New York Yankees, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and Murderers Row. They ran into those guys in the late 1920s. And then in the early 1930s, they ran into the Philadelphia Athletics, who won 3 consecutive pennants, as you know, from 29 to 30 through 31. Then in 1932, the Yankees seemed to be back in the midst of another dynasty. They won the pennant in 1932 by winning 107 games and then swept the Cubs in the World Series. So going into the 1933 season, it looked like, well, most people believe that the Yankees would be unbeatable for a second consecutive year, and we're in the middle of another dynasty. However, the Senators, Clark Griffith, he knew otherwise. He felt that the Senators could take the Yankees with the right combination. So the first thing he did was he hired Joe Cronin, who was 26 years old and is starting shortstop, who was a very good starting shortstop, too, a Hall of Famer who won the American League MVP in 1930. He hired him to manage the club, which was a redo of what he did in 1924 when he hired Bucky Harris, his second baseman at age 27, to manage the club. And everybody laughed, but sure enough, though, Griffith had the last laugh because the Senators won 2 straight pennants and a World Series. Well, in 1933, he went back to that theme, and once again, people were questioning his motive because people thought that Cronin wasn't the same player as Harris, and that saddling him with the managerial job would ruin the ball club. Would ruin his career. Well, Cronin he was delighted to get the job, and he had a pretty good plan to overtake the Yankees. And what they did, Griffith and Cronin, they went to the baseball meeting that year, and they stocked up on players who they felt, veteran ball players who they felt had success against the New York Yankees. And one of the things they did was in order to combat against left-handers like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and Bill Dickey and the rest of those lefties that the Yankees had, hard-hitting left-handed hitters, they went out and they got the best two left-handed pitchers in Earl Whitehill and Lefty Stewart. And sure enough, Earl Whitehill won 22 games for the Senators in 1933, and Lefty Stewart won 15 games for the Senators, including his last 7 of the season. And so it paid off to get those guys, because those guys not only had good seasons, but they were very successful against the Yankees as well. Another thing they did is they went out and they got Goose Goslin, who was once a Senator, but they traded him away. However, they went back and got him in 1933, because not only was he a good hitter who went to the Hall of Fame, he was also very good against the Yankees as well. He hit the Yankees pretty hard throughout his career. So they went out and they got good veteran ball players who felt had success against the Yankees, and they thought a veteran ball club with experience that made limited mistakes would be the key to winning the pennant. And sure enough, they were right. They battled the Yankees that year. They took the Yankees that year, and they finished 6.5 games ahead of the Yankees and won what the writers considered a surprising pennant, because going into the season, the writers were aware that the Senators were making trades and making deals to better their club, but they didn't think it really mattered because they thought the Yankees were going to be that much better.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that about the left-handed pitching, Gary. I can attest to the fact that Washington was built, the stadium was built for left-handed power. That when my dad played and then many years before that, they really didn't have any right-handed power because the left field line was 407 feet. So, to get left-handed pitcher to try to quiet the bats of Gehrig and Ruth when they played at Griffith Stadium was certainly a smart move that Mr. Griffith and Joe Cronin made, because Goose Goslin, he provided power, and Goose and my dad were inducted into the Hall of Fame, into the DC Hall of Stars at the same time in 1989. So my dad and Goose actually shared the outfield duties together in 1938 in Washington. But Washington traditionally had some pretty good pitching, but virtually no right-handed power until the later years when Calvin moved the fence in and created the beer garden, and Allison and Killebrew and Severs and Lemon came on board and really gave Washington that long ball threat. But during those earlier years you were talking about, Washington relied on that great pitching, but really did not have a lot of right-handed power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. In fact, they stacked in the when your father was playing there in the mid to late 30s, or in the late 1930s, I should say, they stacked their lineup with left-handed hitters. I mean, they were a heavily left-handed hitting ball club. In fact, 1937, they had the only all left-handed hitting infield in baseball history, with Buddy Lewis, Buddy Meyer, Cecil Travis, and Joe Kuehl. So, they certainly were big on left-handed hitters. That's for sure.
Well, they wanted line drive hitters too, and they want the right field wall was a high wall, but it was certainly reachable. And the fact that a lot of line drives were hit into doubles. I know Mickey Vernon led the American League a couple of years in doubles, being a left-handed hitter, where the right field, the left field fence was almost unreachable. So to put left-handers in the lineup was a very smart move, and to have that all left-handed infield batters during the years you mentioned, that was certainly a strategy that paid off, and they just really went with the strength of the club, which was pitching, speed, and that left-handed ability of players like Buddy Lewis and Cecil and Buddy Meyer and Joe Kuehl, who played first base during the time that Mickey Vernon was in the Navy. So that's why that left-handed hitting infield was really important to the Washington Ball Club.
Yeah, and a couple things to point out too. When Griffith had purchased the Senators in 1919, when he became the majority owner, he went right to work on building that ballpark, or rebuilding that ballpark, I should say, remodeling it so it accommodated pitchers, because Clark Griffith was a pitcher himself, as you know, back in the 1890s when he pitched for the Chicago Cubs, and he had 6 consecutive 20-win game seasons. But he built that park I think he built it that way because being a pitcher himself, and he wanted a team based on pitching and speed, but also because you got to remember that baseball in 1920 they went to the live ball. You might remember they started getting tougher on pitchers, and they outlawed certain pitches like the spitball, and they started getting tougher on pitchers, and the live baseball made it difficult for pitchers. So Griffith, he retaliated by building a bigger park, and he built that high wall in right field, and then when Babe Ruth had his big season in 1923, he added 6 more feet to that wall in right field. So, he was always trying to help out pitchers and, trying to make it tougher for batters.
Well, Mr. Griffith had the reputation of being that kind of an owner, but, the players loved him, and he had the nickname of the Old Fox. And I think what you just pointed out, Gary, that's an example that, if you're looking at the league and the strength of the league and what you can do to offset some of that strength with the type of ball club you have, and you have the opportunity because Griffith Stadium was named in his honor, and he built the stadium based upon the kind of team that he wanted. And as you said, he's a former pitcher, and pitchers love big ballparks.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think with all these rules about, limiting pitchers, about the pitches they could throw, and I think with going with the live baseball in 1920 definitely inspired him to build a big ballpark with a big field. I think that was his plan to respond to what was going on in baseball at that time.
Hey, Ronnie, I've been dominating this conversation. How about you? You have some questions for Gary?
Yeah, Gary, I'm listening with fascination. I'm really enjoying this whole thing. And I know you've written other books also, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
Quite a few? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about some of the other books you've written.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wrote a book about the New York Yankees, about the first Yankees dynasty, the Yankees, Babe Ruth, and the Yankees manager Miller Huggins, and the rest of Murderers Row in the 1920s. So that was my second book I wrote. I also submitted a few chapters for a Green Bay Packers book about the 1966, the first Super Bowl winning team, the 1966 Green Bay Packers. And I wrote a couple chapters for that book, including the chapter on Vince Lombardi, which was a great honor. And I'm currently working on a book now on the 1924 Senators. And when I get this one done, then I want to switch over and concentrate on Vince Lombardi. Take a break from baseball after this one.
That's terrific. That's terrific.
Gary's writing. Gary's writing about Vince Lombardi, and of course, the other person who was in Washington at that time was Ted Williams. So we're going to talk about Ted on another podcast. But Ted and Vince were both in Washington D.C. at the same time, and that was
at the same
quite
time,
an interesting combination of people that are leading two different sports, two different teams, but in the same city.
That was quite a season
incredible.
Too, because it was quite a season too because in 1969 Vince Lombardi led the Redskins to their first winning season since 1955, and Ted Williams and the Senators won 86 games for their first winning season for the Senators since 1953. So 1969 was certainly a great year to be a Washington sports fan, that's for sure.
For sure, for sure. I don't know if you know the name Eric Simonson. Eric Simonson is a playwright who wrote the Broadway hit Lombardi, and he and I are friends.
Yeah, I heard about that. I would love to have seen that. I'm sorry I missed that.
Yeah. Matter of fact, he wrote a play about my relationship with Jackie Robinson and Jack Kennedy. And it was called The Incredible Season of Ronnie Rabinovitz. Played at the History Theater here in St. Paul. So it was quite an honor. He's really a great guy.
Gary, Ronnie's being modest. He and the Robinson family and the Kennedys have been very, very close, and Ronnie's done a tremendous amount of work over the years for the Jackie Robinson and his memory and all the seasons, and with Sharon Robinson and the Robinson family. So, again, Ronnie's being very modest, but he's a very, very accomplished person when it comes to Jackie Robinson and baseball history.
Well, that's great,
George.
I like to hear that. That's outstanding.
We were very fortunate. We were very dear friends. and it was great. But I'm fascinated with this Washington thing that you're doing, and I find it so interesting, back in those days. And, Ralph had talked a little bit about a possible Hall of Fame. You could even include the Baltimore Elites, that was part of the Negro League, and that's very close to Washington.
Yeah, and not only that, there were other Washington baseball teams. I remember before the Homestead Grays called Washington their home, you had the Washington Pilots, who actually played the first. They actually played the first night game at Griffith Stadium in around 1930 or 1931 when Satchel Paige was pitching for the Pittsburgh Crawfords. They played a night game using movie lights. They played the first night game at Griffith Stadium, and before the Washington Pilots, there was the Washington Black Senators. So Washington baseball actually has a wonderful tradition with
it sure does.
history.
It sure does.
And one of the things I'm trying to do, since I'm part of Sabre's Jerry Malloy Conference, which honors the Negro Leagues, I'm hoping to get the Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference here in Washington, D.C., hopefully in 2 years. That would be wonderful.
Great. That would be great.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating when Gary mentions, and I did not even realize that about the first night game in Washington using temporary lights, because I believe the first night game that the Senators played was in '41, and that's when the lights were permanently installed in Griffith Stadium and in a lot of the other ballparks. Although Yankee Stadium and I think Briggs Stadium were some of the last to put lights in. But, during the war years, it was pointed out to Mr. Griffith that if they went to playing a lot of night games, that, Washington could actually increase their attendance because a lot of people working in the factories and so forth during the war would be able to go to a ball game at night.
Yeah, and Griffith was
I think they were the first one. Weren't they the first team that had lights?
The first team that had lights was the early ones,
Ronnie. I think the first team I think that had lights was the Reds at Crosley Field.
Okay.
I think that was in '39, but shortly after that, Washington stepped up and put lights. Mr. Griffith put lights at Griffith Stadium.
And Griffith was so against lights too.
Yeah, he was pretty amazing. We had his grandson on the other day, Clark Griffith, a couple of months ago. He was very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Well, you guys go ahead with your interview. I think this is so phenomenal. It's just so
we've had a couple people that have that strong association. Clark Griffith was one, and Gary might know him. I had met Clark, and obviously, his namesake. And then, a couple of weeks ago, we had Hank Thomas, and then we had Mark Hornbaker on. So we've had quite an emphasis on the fact of Washington baseball, and Gary, you're certainly a part of that, and we really enjoy having you with us.
I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Certainly do, Gary.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
This is great. You bet.
Sure is.
This is very interesting. Yeah. I wish you good luck with your books. I think it's terrific.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hey, Gary, I wanted to ask you, is your book about the Yankees, is that in print and available now? Because I know that's another interesting subject. We're talking about Washington baseball. When you touch on, the murderer's row and the fact that the Senators really competed against the Yankees during that time, and then, the great A's teams of 29, 30, 31 that many say it was just as strong as the Yankees in murderer's row. But I'm interested a little bit about the Yankees book, if it's in print, and how the book is doing for you.
Yeah, the book is doing good. It is in print. The title of the book is The First Yankees Dynasty, and it's by McFarland Publishing Company. And yes, it is in print.
Great.
Well, McFarland does a lot of Sabre books. I know you did work. You're a Sabre member, and I had been the executive director of Sabre at one time too. So I'm very familiar with the organization. But Sabre is a great repository of baseball history, and anybody who is interested in baseball and knows about the history of the game and wants to learn more, Sabre is a wonderful organization for that.
It sure is. It's a wonderful group of people, and it's wonderful the way they just so much baseball history, just so many different aspects of baseball history. And their next Sabre conference, I should point out, The national conference is coming up here in a couple of weeks at the end of the month. I'm in New York City, so I'm very much looking forward to that, and I'll be there. And we're expecting a great turnout, and it's this is in New York. We're really expecting a great conference this year.
Ralph, you've been really quiet for this. Do you have some comments or questions about Washington baseball?
Well, I have been, and it's what a pleasure to listen to you guys. I just and to the silence of my voice is always refreshing for not only those around me but those out there. So you guys are terrific. I want to make sure that you make it clear that we want you back as a guest and as a recurring guest, and I would like you to be a guest on other programs on the network. We have a New York City baseball show going on Monday nights, and love you to be part of that, and thrilled to have you. We're honored. This has been enlightening, and I just want maybe use this, George, as an opportunity to throw out my idea and at least copyright it through this podcast. That I propose a Washington Senators Homestead Grays /Homestead Grays Hall of Fame in the city of Washington, D.C. And like we were joking off the air, I wouldn't know how to get that started other than to put together the people that can make it happen. And just our guests, we've been doing this about 3-4 months. The guests that we've had are so influential that twixt y'all, you ought to come up with something, and all I ask is that nothing. All I ask is that it goes where it goes, and because it's an idea for its time. We must preserve the memory of our great game if we hope to pass on the great game to our children and grandchildren. Because
right.
what the game is going through now, I look at it as like a hitch in the road. The whole steroid thing, that's not the way the overall game was. Of course, the overall game has had hitches in the road, but it's a hard game to pass on as it is now, what with corporate folks buying the tickets and pricing out the families from taking their kids, elimination of double headers. What a terrific thing that was when I was growing up. You see two games at the price of one. It would ingrain, you'd be out there so long, it would ingrain the game on you. And we don't get that now. We get a bunch of corporate greed that, so let's pass the game on through its history. And no greater history than Washington. I've been learning about it myself. The 1924 book that you alluded to, I'm going to go right to the record books and find out about those guys. And I hope the people that listen to shows on my network do the same thing, and it instills curiosity. And that's why I'm so honored to have guys like you, Ronnie and George, as podcasters, and because you can teach us so much. So, with that said, any of you have anything you want to close it out on?
Well, I want to thank Gary. I think it's wonderful that you were here, and I would say, like Ralph did, we'd love to have you come back and share some more. It's been wonderful. And George, it's always a pleasure.
Well, Ronnie, thank you, and Gary and I will see each other from time to time as we talk about Washington baseball. But it's always fun for me, and I can tell you for a fact, Gary is extremely knowledgeable, and along with Hank Thomas and Mark, we've got quite a group of people interested in Washington baseball, and I'm happy to be part of it and part of this podcast, and always enjoy it.
Well, why don't you run my idea by those guys? And I'll say this. Why don't you run it up the flagpole and see if anybody salutes?
There was a flagpole in deep center field at Yankee Stadium and at Griffith Stadium.
That's right.
Jose, can you see?
Gary, do you live in Washington?
Yes, I do. I live in Alexandria, which is just across the river. But
sure.
Yeah, this is my home now. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you very
Ralph,
much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Always fun to those of you out there. I just implore you to keep on keeping on. Thanks a lot. We'll catch you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.